This is the final story of Chapter 2, Authors. I am honored that you are still with me, learning about the abuses that do not bruise. I would think that for many of you, this chapter has left you confounded about how abuses like this are allowed to happen. I assure you, I was as confounded experiencing them. All the lies I had to suffer for had taken a huge toll on my ability to think clearly. By the time things began to fall apart for Mum and Steve, I don't remember the exact details behind their separation, but I do remember how my family adjusted as the fog cleared. Gramps died of cancer just before Thanksgiving in my 6th grade year. I believe this was a huge factor in the end of the relationship. Steve was indifferent to the whole thing. Mum's parents were in their 40s and 50s when she was born. When Meg started to need full-time medical care, Mum did everything she could to help her parents out as their only child. She was distraught by the illness and death of her father, and the man who was supposed to be there for her in those life trials was entirely absent. This lack of care, in her desperation, seemed to have lifted the veil of desire for Steve in her. It was in January that Steve moved out of the house. They still dated into the fall, but he no longer lived with or near us. There was one other factor that may have led to Steve's departure, a moment witnessed that brought awareness to me and shame. To Steve. Just before Christmas, on my birthday, Steve took me and my brother to his father's home. It was cold and snowy, so when we got there, us kids had to stand on the linoleum floor of the kitchen, so when the snow melted off of us, it did not ruin the floor. We stood there for almost an hour, while Steve visited with his father in the dining room. My brother and I were by the entranceway, so my brother couldn't see what I could through the doorways. As Steve was getting ready to leave, something happened in his conversation with his dad that brought his dad to screaming at Steve. In a flash, his father had knocked over his chair, leaping onto Steve with a belt and fists. I instantly saw the fear, anger, indignity on Steve's face for the unnecessarily cruel punishment he was receiving. I saw tears in Steve's eyes when our gazes met. Mine in a strange mixture of shock and understanding, as a mix of shame and contempt. I quickly looked down and began to get my brother out the door and into the car. I knew we were on the way to go when Steve's dad lashed out. I wanted to make sure my brother and I were not the reason Steve lashed back, so I got us out of there as quickly as possible. We had just gotten into the car when Steve stormed out of the house. He didn't even check to see if we kids were in the car before he had it running, burning rubber as soon as he could get the car into gear. The force of his reckless driving to escape the general area of his father's house had my brother and me slammed into the backs of the seats, sliding side to side on the corners. I wasn't even scared. I had made peace long before that I was probably going to die every day I woke. I felt concerned. It was a long drive home, and somewhere about halfway there, Steve finally acknowledged he hadn't accounted for us kids in his departure. My brother had fallen asleep from the adrenaline crash, but I just looked him in the eyes with pity. I expected him to get furious with me, but he didn't. He looked puzzled, then turned back to the road for the rest of the trip. When we got out of the car at home, Steve got out first to carry my sleeping brother into the house. Before he came around to the open door I had exited from to get my brother, I stood my ground in his path as I looked him in the eyes. You didn't deserve that, Steve. Nobody does, is all I said, and walked away into the house. I was grounded already, so I went straight to my room and did not see or hear from Steve the rest of that day. He acted weird after that. I still got punished, but there wasn't the same level of cruelty or enjoyment by Steve in doing them. A handful of weeks later is when Steve left our home. I never wanted revenge on Steve after that day either. I realized him being alive as himself was punishment enough. My days of being tortured may have been fading out, but a new smog was moving in behind it. We had all suffered at the hands of Steve, but none more than I did. I needed to talk about Ali had been forced to go through so that I could heal. My family did not. They needed to forget that they allowed what happened to me occur without protest. This is when the gaslighting escalated to be nearly every interaction I had with my family. I was the person they all came to for borrowing money. Yet I was called the one who used everyone to get money. I was the one who took care of everyone else's needs before my own. Yet I was labeled the dangerous one who was hurting everyone else. I was constantly and justly poked at about my size, my demeanor, my every greatness became mediocre, drivel in their eyes, and abusive on their tongues. As the fog in my mind from the abuse Steve inflicted lifted, the smug of my family's gaslighting took over. Their shame for what I had suffered was now the newest abuse without bruises in my life. Well, authors, this is the end of chapter 2 in my lifetime of abuse without bruises. I have not suffered as extreme abuses since, but I have gotten close in more recent years. We will cover those in chapter 4. Chapter 3 is going to be about how I navigated the abuses without bruising towards my healing from them. I do hope you will all join me for my tales of growth in chapter 3. It is one of the best parts of my life story, despite the abuses. It does not matter how extreme the events were that created the red words written into our stories. The efforts to remove them are equally difficult, as well as are the hurts caused that we suffered. No victim causes their abuse. No abuse deserves indifference. As our stories are written, we experience the actuality of the red words long before we identify them for what they are. At this point of my life, I desperately sought to be seen, heard, and acknowledged. I willingly did everything I could for everyone else because I wanted my family back again. But we will cover these things with my growth. I hope your awareness to the abuses that do not bruise is increasing, authors. Each one we can identify and correct gives us back ownership of ourselves from the mistreatment of others. Make sure you take the time to edit your stories every so often, authors. Cheers to the growth you have between now and the next chapter.